So here's a thing I've been thinking about for a while. The Walking Dead is, on its face, a show about zombies. And yet the zombies are almost never the point. They're just the weather. They're the background hum of a world that has already ended and keeps ending, quietly, in the margins of every scene. The show is really about the people, and more specifically, it's about what happens to people when they lose other people, over and over again, until loss becomes the condition they're living inside rather than something that happens to them. I've watched this show a lot, more than is probably sensible, and the thing that keeps bringing me back, not the action, not the Walker effects, not the mythology, is the deaths. Not in a morbid way, or at least not entirely. It's more that each major death in this show functions like a chapter break, a before and an after. The show is not quite the same thing on either side of Sophia's barn, or Herschel's head, or Glenn's final words to Maggie. Those moments restructure everything, and there are so many of them. 11 seasons, 177 episodes, and deaths woven through every single one of them, from the very first episode to the very last. Some of them are catastrophic, some are quiet, some of them are the kind of thing you're still thinking about years later, at some unreasonable hour, wondering why a fictional death stuck with you that deeply, which, if you're watching this, is possibly happening right now. One of the reasons I keep coming back to these deaths, specifically, and not just to the show in general, is that The Walking Dead's best deaths don't feel like plot mechanics. They feel like something the show was building toward all along, even when the show itself didn't know it. You can watch season 1 and see the seeds of characters who won't die for 7 more years, and there's something, almost retrospectively, inevitable about how they go. As though the show, for all its inconsistencies, understood its characters better than it sometimes let on. The deaths are where that understanding surfaces most clearly. They're the moments when the show had to commit to who these people actually were, and mostly it did. So what I want to do tonight is just walk through all of them. Every major death, season by season, in roughly the order they happened. Not a ranking, not a countdown, not an argument about which ones were handled well and which ones weren't. Although I do have opinions about that, and they will surface, I can't really promise otherwise. More just a slow, thorough walk through the whole thing. The show's entire history told through the people it chose to take away. It's a long walk. We'll start in Georgia, in a world that still has hospitals and electricity and petrol stations, and we'll end somewhere in the Commonwealth many years later. Along the way, we'll stop at a farm, a prison, a small house in the middle of a pecan grove, a hospital, a town called Alexandria, a kingdom with a tiger, a place called the Hilltop, and eventually a football stadium that became the last functioning city. And at each stop, we'll pay attention to the people who didn't make it to the next one. Before we get into it, just a quick ask. If you're enjoying this, a subscription genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. It's completely free, and it means we can keep making these. Right, that's enough of that. There's also something about the specific shape of grief in this show that I think is worth naming before we begin, because it affects how the deaths land. Most shows, most good shows, treat death as a punctuation mark. Something happens, someone dies, the other characters are sad for an episode or two, and then the show continues. The Walking Dead has always been better than that, at least in its stronger seasons. The grief here is cumulative. It stacks. Each death is carried forward by the characters who survive it, and you can see it in the way they move and make decisions years later. Maggie is still Herschel's daughter when she's leading the Hilltop in season 9. Carol is still the woman who had to shoot her daughter in season 6 when she's burning cabins to protect herself from caring about anyone else in season 10. The show's best quality, and it has several, is its memory. It doesn't reset the emotional ledger, it just keeps adding entries. So when we walk through these deaths, we're not just walking through the plot, we're walking through the accumulating weight of the show's emotional history. And that's rather the right way to approach something at this hour of the evening. So, the beginning. The Walking Dead premiered in October of 2010 on AMC based on the comic series by Robert Kirkman that had been running since 2003. The pilot episode was directed by Frank Darabont, who would go on to be unceremoniously fired after season 1, which is its own fascinating and depressing story for another time. The show opens in a world already ruined, Rick Grimes waking from a coma in an empty hospital, wandering out into a landscape of stacked corpses and silence, eventually finding his way to Atlanta and then to a quarry camp outside the city where his wife and son have been surviving without him. The early seasons have a specific quality that's hard to fully describe. Everything feels fragile in a way that later seasons don't quite manage. The characters are still learning the rules. So is the audience. We don't know yet what this show's willing to do. We're finding out at the same time they are. And the deaths in season 1 and early season 2 carry that same quality. They're the first deaths. They set the terms for everything that follows. Let's start there. It's worth remembering how good things looked for one brief moment in season 1. The group at the quarry outside Atlanta, they had a campsite with running vehicles, working weapons, a reasonably defensible position, and enough supplies to feel like they might be figuring this out. There were dinners and conversations and people teaching children how to fish. There were watch shifts and jokes around the fire, and a sense, tentative but real, that this might be survivable. The Walker attack on the camp in season 1, episode 4, an episode called Vartos, ends all of that in about 4 minutes of screen time. And the first death that the show truly built up to, the first one it asked you to sit with rather than just register, is Amy Harrison. Amy is Andrea's younger sister. She's 19, cheerful, good with a fishing rod, and in the episode immediately before her death, she and Andrea have a conversation on the lakeside about their father and the different fishing techniques he taught each of them depending on their personality. It's a quiet, specific scene that exists for one reason, which is to make sure you care about Amy before the show takes her away. And it works. It always works. You know it's there to make you care, and it makes you care anyway, which is either very good writing or a particularly effective form of emotional manipulation, or probably both. Amy is bitten during the attack. Not heroically, not sacrificially. She steps out of the RV during the chaos, and a walker bites her in the arm, and then the neck, and she goes down, and that's it. She dies in Andrea's arms, slowly, while the camp around them is still being cleared. And then Andrea sits with her through the rest of the night, through the morning, into the next day. She won't let anyone touch Amy's body. She knows Amy is going to turn, and she's waiting. She wants to be the one to do it. Rick tries to talk her down, and she tells him he doesn't know what it's like to be there, and he backs away. And you understand completely why he backs away. When Amy's eyes open and she reaches for her sister, Andrea says, "I know," and shoots her. And that's the first truly devastating moment the show had produced to that point. Not the most devastating it would ever produce, but the first. The terms were now set. Something worth noting about the show's handling of Amy's death is the specific rhythm of the episode before it. The hour immediately preceding her death, episode 4 called Vartos, is probably the warmest episode of season 1. The group retrieves Rick's guns and discovers a nursing home in Atlanta where a man named Guillermo has been protecting the elderly residents with a small group of community volunteers. It's a story about kindness under pressure, about people doing the right thing in a world where the right thing has gotten very complicated, and the episode ends back at camp with a fish dinner and music and people laughing. It lasts maybe 3 minutes of screen time. And then the walkers come. The contrast is not accidental. The show is establishing something it will return to across its entire run: the cost of a moment's peace. Every time the characters allow themselves to feel safe, the world sends a correction. Not cruelly, not out of any moral logic, just because that's the nature of the world they're living in. Safety is temporary. Joy has a price. The question is whether you pay it or you stop letting yourself feel anything to avoid the bill. Andrea chooses to feel it. Even after Amy, through all the seasons that follow, Andrea keeps reaching toward hope, which is one of the things the show doesn't give her enough credit for. Ed Pelletier dies in the same attack, which is a slightly different kind of note. Ed is Carol's abusive husband. He's been established very specifically across the preceding episodes as a man who hits his wife, controls his daughter, and radiates a low-level menace that the show frames as distinctly pre-apocalypse evil. The kind of man the world had structures to deal with, however inadequately, that no longer exist. When the walkers get into his tent during the attack, the show doesn't linger. He dies, and the audience's relationship to his death is complicated in a way that Amy's isn't at all. There's no grief there, or very little, just an acknowledgement that the world has taken another person, even a person whose absence makes the world marginally better. There's something the early show does quite intelligently with Ed's death, which is to make Carol the one who keeps stabbing his reanimated corpse well past the point of necessity. She puts more violence into that moment than survival requires. It's the first glimpse of what Carol Pelletier is going to become over the next 10 seasons, the woman who came after the wife who couldn't leave. Jim is harder to categorize. He gets bitten during the same attack, and his death is a long, quiet, days-long departure. A man choosing when and how to go rather than being taken. He asks to be left by a tree on the side of the road, within sight of the walkers, and the group honors that. It's the first death by walker bite we really see play out in its full duration, and it establishes something important. The bite is a sentence. There's no treatment, no reprieve. Once you're bitten, the question is only how you want to spend whatever time is left. Jim's backstory, which comes out in the episode where he digs graves at the camp, Season 1, Episode 4, the episode before the attack, is one of the show's quietest pieces of foreshadowing. He survived the early days because the walkers were busy with his family. They ate his wife and his sons while he watched and could do nothing. The digging he can't explain when Dale asks him about it. The dreaming he can't account for. It's a man whose unconscious mind is processing something his conscious mind can't yet look at directly. By the time the attack comes and he's bitten, there's a sense that Jim was ready, not seeking it, but not entirely afraid of it either. He asks to be left near the walkers specifically. That detail. He doesn't ask to be driven far away and left somewhere peaceful. He asks to be left near them, as if proximity to the thing that took his family is where he belongs now. The group leaves him under the tree and drives away, and nobody speaks, and the show understands that some departures don't need anything more than that. And then there's the CDC. The group arrives at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, having spent the previous episodes being herded toward it by the idea that scientists would be working on a cure, that there would be answers, that someone would have figured something out. And there is one person left, Dr. Edwin Jenner, played by Noah Emmerich, who has been alone in the building for a very long time and has run out of a good reason to keep going. He lets the group in. He feeds them. He shows them what the infection does to the brain. That remarkable sequence of TS19, the MRI scan of a brain going through the fever and the death and the reanimation. And then he tells them that the building is set to self-destruct and that he'd rather stay. Jenna dies in the explosion along with Jackie, one of the group's quieter members, who also chooses to stay. The building going up takes with it the last organised scientific response to the epidemic, the last functioning computer system with data about the pathogen, and the last character who represented the possibility of an institutional answer to any of this. After the CDC, the show never again holds out the promise of a cure in any serious way. It just accepts that the world is what it is now, and the people in it have to find their own reasons to continue. Jenna also whispers something to Rick before they leave. The show doesn't tell us what it is for 2 full seasons, which in retrospect is one of the show's better narrative decisions. Whatever Jenna tells Rick, that everyone is already infected, that the reanimation happens regardless of whether you're bitten, visibly affects Rick's behaviour in ways that make sense in hindsight. He keeps it to himself. He carries it. That's the kind of secret that doesn't make things better to share, and doesn't go away if you don't. Jacqui's choice to stay is handled very briefly. She tells the group she's not coming. The group argues briefly, and then she says quietly that this is what she's chosen, and that's all. She's been a background presence across season 1, someone the show never built a full story for. Her death feels like the show acknowledging that not every person in a crisis gets a complete arc. Most people in a crisis are just trying to survive, and then they stop. That's what season 1 deaths do as a collection. They establish the rules. Anyone can go. The good and the gentle and the cruel and the hopeful. The scientists and the children. The ones with reasons to live and the ones without. And the show asking you to sit with that, quietly, right from the beginning. Season 2 moves the group out of Atlanta and onto a Georgia highway, which is where they find the farm. Herschel Green's farm, which will matter enormously in a few sections. But first we need to talk about what happens before they get settled in, because the show's second season establishes something important about the moral cost of survival, and it does it very early, very quietly, and very specifically. Carl gets shot in the woods, not by a person, by a hunter accidentally, the bullet passing through a deer and then into Carl. He needs surgery. The farm has a veterinarian, Herschel, who can do it, but they need medical supplies from a school nearby that's been overrun. Rick and Shane can't go alone. The only person who knows the school is Otis, the man who accidentally shot Carl, who offers to go with them to make it right. Otis. Worth pausing on him for a moment. He's played by Pruitt Taylor Vince, who has one of those faces you trust immediately. A big soft-spoken man who made a horrible mistake and is genuinely, quietly devastated by it, and is willing to walk into a school full of walkers to try to fix it. He's on screen for maybe 30 minutes of total screen time across 2 episodes, and yet his death is one of the show's most unsettling in the first 2 seasons, specifically because of how it happens. They get the supplies, they're running out, they can't outrun the walkers, and Shane in the dark makes a calculation. He shoots Otis in the leg, he takes the supplies, he leaves Otis for the walkers to slow down the pursuit, and he gets back to the farm with everything needed to save Carl. Carl is saved. We don't see what happens to Otis, we don't have to. We see Shane arrive at the farm with a patch of his own hair missing. Otis pulled it out in those last moments, fighting. And we see Shane tell the group that Otis told him to go, that he sacrificed himself, that he was brave. And we see Shane believe his own story just enough to be able to tell it, and not quite enough that his face does what it would need to do to be convincing. What the show is doing with Shane at this point is something quite careful. He isn't framed as a villain. He isn't even framed as wrong exactly. The math did require someone to be sacrificed, and Carl did survive as a direct result. What he's framed as is a man who has decided that the apocalypse has different rules, and that in different rules situations, the person best positioned to make the calculation is the person who has the most invested in the outcome. Shane's logic is almost coherent if you follow it all the way through and don't look at its edges too carefully. The problem is that his logic has edges, lots of them. There's a scene later in season 2 where Shane shaves his head. The patch Otis pulled out is just the beginning, and he goes further, taking it all off, and the visual symbolism is fairly straightforward but effective. He's shedding something. He's becoming someone who looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize who's there, and his response is to stop looking for recognition rather than to reckon with the change. John Bernthal plays Shane with enormous commitment across both seasons, and you understand the character's logic even while you watch it destroying him. Shane loved Laurie, Shane loved Carl, Shane genuinely believed that Rick's hesitation was going to get people killed and that his own decisiveness was the thing keeping the group alive. He wasn't wrong about all of it. He was wrong enough. It's the first moment the show tells you that Shane Walsh is dangerous in a specific way. Not to walkers, but to the story the group is telling itself about who they are. Shane isn't wrong, exactly, that the math required someone to be left behind. He's wrong about who got to make that calculation, and he's wrong about what it costs a person to make it the way he made it. Otis's death matters less as a loss of a character than as the introduction of a theme. That survival will require things, and the things it requires will change the people doing the surviving, and those changes compound. Shane is different after Otis, and the show doesn't let him pretend otherwise, even when he tries. There's also something worth noting about how the group receives the story Shane brings back from the school. They hold a small memorial. The account Shane gives is plausible, and the group accepts it because they're not in a position to question it. Carl is in surgery. Everyone is still raw from the chaos of the outbreak's early days, and the possibility that Shane killed Otis on purpose is not a thought anyone is ready to have. So the lie holds, and the wrongness of it lives in Shane's increasingly strange eyes and in the way he watches Rick with something that isn't quite jealousy and isn't quite contempt, but is a very specific and corrosive combination of both. The farm is full of secrets by the time season 2 ends. Most of them originate from the dark field where Otis died. I've seen season 2 of The Walking Dead multiple times, and I still find the Sophia arc difficult to watch. Not because it's bad television, it's some of the best television the show ever made, but because of what it does to you if you let it. Sophia Pelletier is 12 years old. She's Carol's daughter. In the season 2 premiere, she gets spooked during a walker encounter on the highway and runs into the woods. And Rick follows her and hides her near a creek and tells her to stay put while he draws the walkers away and comes back. And when he comes back, she's gone. The first half of season 2 is the search for Sophia. The group spreads across Herschel's farm and the surrounding woods, and they look, and they don't find her, and they keep looking. Daryl, in particular, becomes consumed by it in a way that tells you everything you need to know about who Daryl Dixon is at his core. A man who grew up feeling forgotten and invisible, who will not let a child feel that. He rides out alone. He finds a doll. He climbs a cliff and finds a walker wearing her shoe and nearly dies from the fall and the infection. And he still comes back, and he says he believes she's alive. There's something happening with Daryl in the Sophia search that goes beyond a secondary character looking for a missing child. Daryl grew up with a father who was absent in the most corrosive possible way, present but not there, abusive, indifferent to whether his children survived as long as they didn't inconvenience him. Merle, who was supposed to be the strong one, mostly just modelled different versions of the same damage. Daryl had spent his entire life being the person nobody was looking for, and here is this child who ran into the woods and needs someone to not give up on her. And Daryl is the one who won't. He rides out when no one else will. He brings back a Cherokee rose and tells Carol about the folklore, that the flowers grew from the tears of mothers along the Trail of Tears, a story his grandmother told him. A piece of himself he didn't have to share, but did. He's not performing optimism. He actually, despite everything, believes she might be out there. The show uses this search to do something important for Daryl's arc, without being obvious about it. He starts season 2 as the group's wild card, the one they're not entirely sure about, the one whose loyalty feels conditional. By the time the barn doors open, he's the heart of the group. The search for Sophia is what makes him that. The group argues about whether to keep looking. They find a barn full of walkers that Herschel has been locking up, people from the surrounding area who he still, with extraordinary and painful hope, believes might be cured. And then there's a confrontation about whether to stay or go, and the barn doors open, and the walkers come out, and the group kills them one by one, and then the last walker comes out of the barn. It's Sophia, in the same clothes she was wearing when she ran into the woods. She's turned. She's been in that barn the whole time, and Herschel knew, and everyone had been tearing the countryside apart for weeks while she was 30 yards from where they slept. Rick is the one who walks forward and shoots her. Not Daryl, not Carol, not Shane, Rick. Because Rick is the one who hid her by that creek. Because there's an argument, which the show doesn't make explicitly, but leaves plainly visible, that this is the consequence of that choice. His choice, to hide her rather than keep her with the group. Carol can't watch. She turns away before it happens, And then the group stands there in the mud outside the barn, and there is just silence, because what is there to say? That silence after the gunshot is one of the best directorial choices the show ever made. It holds. It doesn't cut away quickly, doesn't move to the next scene, doesn't score itself with music that tells you what to feel. It just stays in the grey morning with these people standing in the mud, and you understand, without being told, that something has shifted in each of them. Something about what the world can take and what hope actually means when you're inside this. The show's willingness to hold that silence is connected to Frank Darabont's influence on the first season and Glenn Mazzara's steady hand in the second. The pacing of the barn sequence, the rhythm of the walkers coming out one by one, the specific deliberateness of Rick walking forward, it's all choreographed to make sure the audience has arrived at the barn's full weight before the last door opens. That craft is what separates the Sophia reveal from a cheap shock. It's been built for 7 episodes. You've watched people love this child at a distance. The arrival of the answer is terrible because the question was asked with so much care. Sophia's death is the one the show built its entire second season around, and it earns everything it asks for. It's not a shock death in any conventional sense. By the time she walks out of that barn, a significant part of the audience had already guessed, or feared, or quietly accepted. What makes it devastating is the duration. 7 episodes of watching people who love this child refuse to give up on her, and then finding out that the thing they were refusing to give up on had already been taken. The hope itself is what hurts. The hope is the trap. And then what it does to Carol. If you want to understand Carol Pelletier's entire arc across the following 9 seasons, the woman she becomes, the things she's capable of, the choices she makes, it starts here, in the mud, watching Rick raise the gun. I want to talk about Dale Horvath for a minute, because I think he's one of the most underrated characters in the show's early run, and his death is one of the most quietly gutting things Season 2 does. Dale is the older man with the RV and the binoculars. He's been watching the camp from the roof since the beginning, literally and figuratively. He's the character who insists, repeatedly, on having a moral framework in a world that seems designed to destroy moral frameworks. When the group captures a young man named Randall and debates what to do with him, and the debate turns quickly toward just killing him to eliminate the risk, Dale is the one who makes the counter-argument. He goes to each person in the group individually and tries to convince them that they cannot do this, that killing a man who hasn't done anything is the line they cannot cross, that once they cross it, they are something different and they don't come back. And he loses. Almost everyone in the group votes to execute Randall anyway. What makes Dale's argument in that episode particularly moving is not that it's naive. It isn't. Quite. But that he knows he's losing and keeps making it anyway. He understands that the world has changed and that changed worlds, produce changed people, and that his version of moral reasoning may simply not survive the transition. But he refuses to accept that as sufficient justification for abandoning it. This world is turning rotten, he tells the group at one point, and we have to take a stand. He says it knowing they've already decided, knowing they think he's out of step with reality, knowing he sounds like someone who hasn't adapted. He says it anyway. Jeffrey DeMunn plays Dale with a specific, unflashy warmth that makes the character feel real in a way that's hard to manufacture. He's not the comic book sage or the wise elder or any of the archetypal roles the show could have put him in. He's just a man with a strong sense of right and wrong, who is watching the world make that sense harder and harder to maintain, and who hasn't decided to stop trying yet. And then the very same evening, Dale wanders into the dark by himself and finds a dying cow in the field, and a walker guts him before Carl can get there, and the group has to shoot him in mercy because there's no saving him from a stomach wound that severe. It's awful in a specific way. The show spent 25 minutes letting Dale make the case for human decency and lost, and then in the same episode, the world just takes him anyway, in the most undignified way possible. in the dark by himself, for no reason. There's no meaning to it. He didn't die protecting someone or making a sacrifice. He went for a walk at the wrong moment, and that was that. Shane Walsh's death is different in almost every way. Shane's death has been building since the pilot episode. Two men in love with the same woman, one of them her husband, the other the man who kept her alive and protected her son while her husband was in a coma. Shane believes Rick is going to get people killed. Shane believes he would be a better leader. And somewhere along the way, Shane stopped being wrong about everything and started being wrong about everything. The argument the show makes through Shane is one that deserves more credit than it usually gets. Shane is not wrong that Rick hesitates in ways that cost the group. He's not wrong that the moral calculus of the old world doesn't translate cleanly to this one. What he's wrong about is who he is, or more precisely, what he's wrong about is that the version of himself that would make decisions without flinching is the version of himself worth being. Shane never asks whether the man who can do these things is a man worth saving. He just becomes that man and tells himself it's necessary and stops asking. There's a scene in the episode where Randall is killed where Rick and Shane walk out into a field together and Shane turns his gun on Rick and Rick stabs him. John Bernthal plays that moment with a strange quality that I find genuinely moving. Shane seems almost relieved, at some level, that it's happening. He's been carrying the weight of what he chose to become since the night in the field with Otis, and the weight has been getting heavier, and this is the end of carrying it. Rick and Shane go into the dark together, ostensibly to release Randall far from the farm, and Rick figures out what's happening before it happens. And when Shane raises the gun, Rick puts a knife in him. Not a gun, a knife. Up close and personal and specific, in a way that a gun from a distance would not be. Carl sees his father stabbing Shane. Carl shoots Shane when he reanimates. And that sequence, Rick doing what he had to do, Carl doing what he had to do, both of them understanding completely what it means, is the moment the show fully steps into who Rick Grimes is going to be. Not the moral counterweight to Shane, not the cautious, hesitating leader, the man who does what needs doing, whatever that turns out to be. Jimmy and Patricia are worth a brief mention. They die in the chaos of the barn fire at the season finale, the farm overrun by a herd, everyone separated in the smoke and the dark. They don't get the send-off that Dale or Shane get. They're casualties of the chaos, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. Not every death in a zombie apocalypse arrives with meaning attached. Some of them are just the dark claiming whoever's in the wrong place. The group drives away from the burning farm, and Rick tells them, on a bridge in the grey morning, that this is not a democracy anymore. The farm is behind them. The prison is ahead. Season 3 opens with the group moving in absolute silence. No talking, almost no music. They clear a house in coordinated movements, every person knowing their role, no hesitation. There's a time cut between the end of Season 2 and the beginning of Season 3, and the group that emerges from it is markedly different. Leaner, quieter, more capable, and demonstrably sadder. They find the prison in the first episode and clear it and claim it and call it home. And for a few episodes, it almost is. T-Dog has been with the group since the beginning. Almost since the very beginning. He was in Atlanta with Glenn when Rick arrived. He's been in nearly every episode of the first 2 seasons, and the show never quite found the right amount to do with him. He had a handful of really good moments scattered across 24 episodes, and a lot of scenes where he was present but peripheral. This is the show's failing, not his. Lawrence Gilliard Jr. gave T-Dog a quiet dignity that the scripts rarely met. His death in Season 3, Episode 4, an episode called Killer Within, is a sacrifice. He holds off a corridor of walkers with his body, so Carol can get through a door. He gets bitten doing it, and he knows he's bitten, and he keeps going anyway, keeps fighting, gives her every second he can. It's a good death in the sense that the show uses it to demonstrate exactly who T-Dog was, even if it took until his last scene to do so, which is, again, the show's failing. Laurie Grimes dies in the same episode. Laurie has been a divisive character since Season 1. The show never quite resolved its relationship with her. She was frequently framed in ways that invited criticism, positioned as the obstacle or the complication, written into situations where the audience was pushed to be frustrated with her choices, rather than empathetic to them. This is one of the early show's genuine weaknesses. Laurie had dimensions that the scripts didn't always commit to. Her fear about Carl becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone the apocalypse had reshaped in ways she couldn't reach, was one of the most honest emotional threads the show had, and it didn't get enough room. What the show got consistently right about Laurie was her love for Rick and Carl, and the way that love was complicated by the 3 years she spent believing Rick was dead and finding a different kind of survival with Shane. That's a genuinely difficult situation, and the show rarely treated it with the nuance it deserved, but Sarah Wayne Callies brought real feeling to it in the moments the scripts allowed. She dies in Season 3, Episode 4, called Killer Within, in a dark section of the prison, with Maggie and Carl. There are complications. The baby is the wrong way. There's no anaesthetic, no surgeon, and not enough time. Maggie tells Laurie that the only way to save the baby is a cesarean, and both of them know what that means, that Laurie won't survive it. And Laurie says yes. She says yes, and she gives Carl instructions about who he should become, and she tells him she loves him. And then Maggie performs the procedure, and Judith is born, and Laurie is gone. And then Carl shoots his mother. That sequence, Maggie holding the baby, Carl making the choice to prevent his mother's reanimation, the sound of the single gunshot, is one of the most devastating things the show produced across its entire run. It asks enormous things of the young actor Chandler Riggs, who was 13 at the time, and he delivers everything it asks and then some. Rick doesn't know yet when he sees Carl come out of the prison without Laurie. He watches his son's face, and he understands before Carl says a word. Andrew Lincoln's performance in the next 5 minutes doesn't require any dialogue. He collapses. Not metaphorically, he actually folds to the floor in Herschel's arms, and the sounds he makes are not television, grief sounds. There's something more uncomfortable than that. Judith crying in the background, the baby alive, Laurie not, Rick on the floor of a prison corridor. That's the moment Season 3 announces itself. What follows over the next several episodes is the show doing something quite precise with Rick's grief. He starts seeing Laurie, not as a comforting vision, as a haunting. She appears on the catwalk in a white dress, silent, watching. He gets a phone call at one point from the woman he loved, speaking to him from wherever the dead go. He answers it. He talks to her. He knows it isn't real, and he talks to her anyway, because the part of him that knows it isn't real is the smaller part in that moment. The phone call sequence in an episode called Hounded is one of the stranger things Season 3 does, and also one of the more psychologically honest. Rick is not mad exactly. He's a man who has experienced a loss he hasn't yet found a way to put inside himself, and the phone is how his mind buys the time it needs to start processing. By the time he understands who he's actually been talking to, the voices of people they've lost, projections of his own grief, he's ready to go back to the living. Just barely, but ready. He comes back to Judith, Laurie's living consequence, and the sight of his daughter in Daryl's arms is the thing that completes it. That's the show telling you what Laurie's death meant in narrative terms. Not only the loss, but the transfer. The baby survives. The father keeps going. The group endures into the next thing. The governor gets a full discussion later when we get to Season 4, but Season 3 builds him carefully across 16 episodes and then takes several people away in its final stretch. And those deaths deserve their own attention. Axel is played by Lou Temple, and he's one of those characters who comes from nowhere and turns into someone you're rather fond of quite quickly. He's a convict who was in the prison when the group found it, a slightly bumbling, good-natured man who clearly hadn't been a very successful criminal even before the world ended. He flirts cluelessly with Carol. She shuts it down, patiently, and he seems to be finding his footing and becoming someone the group can actually rely on. He dies mid-sentence. The governor's forces attack the prison in Season 3, Episode 10, called Home, and Axel is talking to Carol, just talking, and a sniper round takes him without warning. Carol ends up using his body as cover while the firefight continues. He doesn't finish whatever he was saying. The show doesn't tell us what it was. That's rather the point. It's one of the most casually brutal moments in the show's run. Not because it's graphic, but because it's arbitrary. The conversation was going nowhere in particular, and then it simply stopped. That's what a sniper does to a story. Merle Dixon's arc is something the show pulls off better than it had any right to. Merle is introduced in Season 1 as, essentially, a racist, abrasive thug who gets handcuffed to a pipe on a roof in Atlanta and has to hack his own hand off to escape. He spends Season 2 absent, resurfaces in Season 3 as the governor's enforcer, and the show spends most of the season establishing him as the obstacle between Daryl's world and Rick's world. And then in the penultimate episode of Season 3, Merle does something genuinely unexpected. He lets Michonne go. He's driving her to be handed over to the governor, a deal Rick had been considering to end the conflict, and he stops the car and cuts her loose. And then he drives alone to the meeting point, and he gets drunk and turns up the music, and he turns the car into a rolling distraction, drawing walkers behind him, and he takes a sniper position, and he shoots the governor's men, one by one, 7 of them picked off from the shadows. He nearly gets the governor himself before Ben gets in the line of sight. What's worth sitting with in that sniper sequence is the specificity of it. Merle had spent 2 seasons being a man whose capabilities were used in service of violence and cruelty, and his final act is to use those same capabilities, the marksmanship, the tactical thinking, the willingness to go it alone, in service of people who had every reason to write him off. He doesn't call Daryl to tell him. He doesn't ask for acknowledgement or absolution. He just does it, alone, on the off chance it helps. The whiskey and the music on the car stereo are not bravado. They're Merle buying himself the courage to do something he isn't sure he deserves to do. And then he does it anyway. They take Merle. The governor beats him to death in an abandoned building, shoots him, and then Daryl finds his brother turned in a field and has to kill him. Michael Rooker and Norman Reedus both have almost no dialogue in that scene, and need none. The scene is just Daryl on his knees, and it's among the most affecting pieces of acting in the show's entire run. Merle Dixon's death is the show's best argument that people can change. Not easily, not completely, not without cost, but change. There's also something the show does with Daryl after Merle's death that is worth noting. He doesn't talk about it, really. He doesn't have a formal grief scene with Rick or Carol or anyone. He just comes back to the prison, and he's different in a specific, contained way. The absence of the chip on his shoulder that had always been there, partly because Merle had put it there. Merle spent years making Daryl feel small and dependent and wrong, and the thing Daryl Dixon becomes after Merle's death is someone who no longer has to carry that weight. It doesn't make the grief smaller, it just changes its shape. Milton Mamet is the governor's scientist, a quiet, bookish man who has been complicit in terrible things by choosing not to look directly at them. His final act is to leave a pair of pliers near Andrea's chair in the torture room, hidden under the tray, so she has a chance of cutting herself free. It's a small act of bravery from a man who had spent the whole season finding reasons not to be brave. The governor stabs him multiple times and leaves him to turn. He doesn't quite die in time to save Andrea, but not for lack of trying. Andrea. I've read a lot of takes on Andrea's death over the years, and they range from the show was finally free of a character they'd mishandled, to this was a tragic end to one of the most unfairly treated characters in the series. I'm somewhere in between. The show did mishandle Andrea across Season 3, repeatedly putting her in positions where the audience was frustrated with her choices in ways that felt constructed rather than earned. But the death itself is genuinely sad in a specific way. The Andrea of the comic series is one of the most beloved characters Kirkman wrote, Rick's partner in the later volumes, a sniper of extraordinary skill, someone whose arc across the comics is one of the medium's best examples of a character earning who they become through what they survive. The Andrea of the television show got a different story, and a shorter one, and the specific shape of her death, so close to the door, bitten by the person she'd trusted to give her time, is the show acknowledging, in the only language it had left for her, that she tried, that she was trying, that she wasn't the naive woman the season had sometimes written her as, but someone who looked at a bad situation and kept trying to find the solution that didn't require everyone to die. She's alone in the governor's torture room. She gets to the pliers. She works at her restraints for the entirety of the episode, intercut with everything else happening. She almost gets free. She does get free, with Milton turning in the same room, and she almost makes it to the door, and Milton bites her on the shoulder before she can get out. Rick and Michonne arrive seconds too late. Andrea gets to say goodbye. She insists on being the one to do it herself. She tells Michonne she doesn't want Michonne to be alone. And then the shot, and the silence. There's a reading of Andrea's death that I find more true the more I sit with it, which is that the show was trying to say something about the cost of trying to find common ground. Andrea believed, longer than almost anyone, that the people at Woodbury and the people at the prison didn't have to be enemies. She kept trying to find the conversation that would end it without more bloodshed. She wasn't wrong to try, she just tried it with the wrong person, and the consequence was absolute. The governor drives away from Woodbury. He'll be back. Season 4 opens at the prison in a state of something that almost looks like normalcy. The survivors have built something: crops, a council, a school, a medical bay. There are new people who came from Woodbury after its fall. Families with children, old people, a community with something resembling structure. Rick has put down his gun and picked up a garden fork. It's the closest thing to peace the show had offered to that point. And then people start dying of the flu. The illness storyline in Season 4's first half is, I think, one of the more underrated things the show did. It introduces a threat that cannot be outrun or outfought or negotiated with. A pathogen moving through the prison population and taking people quietly in their cell blocks away from the action. Patrick is 16 and collapses in the shower. He turns in the night and wanders through the block and kills 6 people before dawn. Karen and David are taken to an isolated cell block to prevent the spread, and Carol kills them both and burns the bodies, a decision that fractures her relationship with the group permanently. The Karen and David killings are worth pausing on because they reveal something about Carol that Season 2's barn and Season 4's grove are both building toward. Carol didn't kill Karen and David because she hated them or because she was afraid for herself specifically. She killed them because she ran the calculation, determined that the risk they posed to the wider community outweighed the ethics of what she was about to do, and acted before anyone could talk her out of it. There was no committee, there was no consultation. She made the decision, and she carried it out, and she burned the evidence, and she came back to the group and kept going. That's not a monster's reasoning. It's not even necessarily wrong reasoning. It's the reasoning of someone who has been in too many situations where hesitation was the thing that got people killed, who has internalized the lesson that the window for action is narrow, and the people who wait for certainty are the people who lose. Carol was learning across Season 4 how to live inside that logic without being destroyed by it. Whether she succeeded is an open question. The show runs for the next 7 seasons. Herschel is the one who goes into the quarantine block to treat the sick. He goes knowing the risk because someone has to, and he's willing, and he's Herschel. He sits with the dying, he reads to the feverish. He tells Rick the thing about sad souls being more dangerous than germs, and he means it completely. The Grove is Season 4, Episode 14, and I think it might be the single most quietly devastating episode of television the show ever produced. Carol, Tyrese, Judith, and 2 girls, Lizzie and Mika Samuels, are making their way to Terminus after the prison falls. They find a house in a pecan grove, clean and stocked and surrounded by quiet, and they stop to rest. And very slowly, over the course of the episode, the particular damage that the apocalypse has done to Lizzie Samuels becomes visible. Lizzie doesn't understand that walkers are dead. Or rather, she does understand it intellectually, but she doesn't feel it. She's been feeding the walkers at the prison fence. She's been giving them names. She believes they're people who are just different now. And this belief has been present in small ways since season 3, handled carefully by the writers as something that might be autism or PTSD or some other response to a world that had broken all the frameworks she had for understanding it. And in the Grove, it reaches its conclusion. Carol and Tyrese come back to find Mika dead in the yard. Lizzie killed her sister. She wanted to show Carol that walkers aren't dangerous, that Mika would come back and they'd all see. She's still holding the knife. Judith is nearby in her carrier, alive. Mika deserves a moment here because she's been the more thoughtful, more articulate of the two girls, and the show has built her carefully as a specific kind of gentle. She refuses to kill people, even in extremis. She tells Carol at one point that she doesn't want to be mean, that she knows how to kill walkers, but she doesn't want to be the kind of person who kills people. And Carol is frightened by this gentleness because she recognizes it as something the world will not accommodate. Mika is right about what she wants to be. She's just wrong about whether the world will allow it. The specific thing the episode does with Mika's death is to let the horror land through Carol's face rather than through anything the show shows you directly. You come back to the yard and Mika is there, and Lizzie is standing over her with the bloody knife and is talking about how Mika will come back and everything will be fine, and the show is watching Carol's face the whole time. And what Melissa McBride does in those seconds is one of the finest pieces of acting the show ever captured. Grief and horror and the immediate, terrible necessity of suppressing both in order to manage the situation in front of her. I find it very difficult to write about this scene in a way that doesn't feel inadequate, which is probably the right response to it. Melissa McBride plays Carol's realization across about 10 seconds of facial expression, and it's extraordinary. The moment she understands what's happened, then the moment she understands what has to happen next, then the moment she accepts it. She tells Lizzie to look at the flowers and count, the way Mika used to tell her when she was upset. And while Lizzie is looking at the flowers, Carol shoots her. The episode ends with Carol and Tyrese sitting at the kitchen table in the Grove house, two people who have just done and witnessed things that cannot be undone or unseen. And Carol confesses to Tyrese that she was the one who killed Karen and David at the prison. She puts her gun on the table between them and tells him to do whatever he needs to do. Tyrese forgives her. The pecan trees outside the window, the flowers in the yard, just survive somehow. There are a handful of deaths across the entire run of The Walking Dead that I think about more than others. Herschel Green is at the top of that list. Herschel started season 2 as an obstacle. He owned the farm, he had complicated feelings about whether the group could stay. He still believed, with the faith of a man who had nothing left to put his faith in, that the walkers were sick people who might be cured, which is why he'd been locking them in his barn. He lost that faith in the worst possible way when the barn opened and Sophia walked out. And what happened to Herschel after that is one of the most beautiful character arcs the show produced. He became the group's moral centre, not in a preachy way. Herschel was past preaching. He'd had his beliefs tested too many times, and he'd come out the other side with something quieter and more durable than faith, something more like grace. He lost his leg in the prison in season 3 and learned to walk on a prosthetic and didn't stop. He read books. He kept his King James Bible. He sat with the sick during the flu outbreak and talked to them and held their hands, knowing the risk because someone had to and he was willing. He helped Glenn propose to Maggie. He told Rick that the deal with the governor was off when Rick came to him about handing over Michonne, and he listened while Rick worked it back out for himself. Scott Wilson played Herschel across 4 seasons with so much quiet precision that it's genuinely hard to write about the character without the performance overriding everything. There's a moment in season 4, episode 3, called Isolation, where Herschel goes into the quarantine cell block to treat the sick people, and Glenn asks him why, and Herschel says, "A sad soul can kill you quicker, far quicker than a germ." He means it. He's not performing optimism. He's just someone who has figured out what actually matters and has decided to act on it. He's taken hostage by the governor at the start of the Season 4 mid-season finale, an episode called Too Far Gone. Michonne is taken with him, and then the governor arrives at the prison gates in a tank and gives Rick an ultimatum: leave by sundown or people die. Rick makes a speech. It's one of his best. He talks about coming back, about people not being too far gone, about how everyone on both sides of that fence has done terrible things, and there's still a way forward that doesn't end in more of this. He's speaking specifically to the Woodbury people the governor has brought along, trying to reach whoever might be reachable. And Herschel is watching from across the field, tied up, and he smiles when he hears Rick talking, because Rick has found something he thought Rick had lost. That smile is the last good thing in the episode. It's worth pausing on what that smile means, because it carries the whole of Herschel Green in it. Herschel has spent 3 seasons watching Rick move back and forth along a line between hope and despair, between the version of himself that believes in something and the version of himself that has been scoured clean by loss. And what Rick is saying across that field to the governor's people is the most Herschel thing Rick has ever said. He's using the same argument Herschel always made, that people can come back, that nobody is too far gone, that the door is open if you choose to walk through it. Rick learned it from Herschel. He's saying it now, and Herschel hears it, and the smile is Herschel understanding that it took. Scott Wilson filmed that scene at a distance, tied to a fence post, with only his face to work with. And what he does with it is everything the character ever was. The smile says, "You got it." The smile says, "Whatever happens now, you have this." That's enough. The governor says liar and brings the katana down. The first blow doesn't finish it. Herschel is still alive on the ground, trying to crawl away. The governor keeps going. Beth and Maggie are watching from inside the prison. The shot of Herschel trying to crawl, and the governor's expression and the sounds the scene makes is the most genuinely horrible sequence the show produced across its entire run. And I mean that as description, not as criticism. It should be horrible. That's the point. The prison battle that follows, it takes several more lives. The governor ultimately impaled by Michonne and shot through the head by Lily, who had just watched her daughter Megan get bitten and die in her arms outside the walls while the battle was happening. The governor's end feels earned in a way that his first near death in Season 3 didn't, because the show spent the back half of Season 4's first run actually excavating who Philip Blake was before the apocalypse and what it did to him. David Morrissey plays the governor across 3 episodes in Season 4 in a completely different register than Season 3. Quieter, emptier, a man whose eyes have gone somewhere they can't easily come back from. He finds the Chandler family in an apartment building, and he's not performing kindness exactly. He's just doing what proximity to people who need things requires. There's a genuinely affecting sequence where he burns his eye patch and seems, for a moment, like he might be leaving Philip Blake behind. He teaches one of the daughters, Megan, to play chess. He moves the pieces carefully and explains that a pawn can become a queen, and the metaphor is obvious, but the tenderness in the scene is not. And then the old man in the room with them turns, and the governor kills him with his bare hands. And the violence in that moment is so far in excess of what the situation required that Lily, watching, understands something the show has been building toward all episode. He doesn't do what needs doing. He does everything he has, every time, because that's the only setting he has left. He's not a moustache-twirling villain in those episodes. He's a man who rebuilt himself around rage and told himself it was love, and kept going until the distinction stopped mattering. The prison falls. The bus leaves without everyone on it. Daryl and Beth run into smoke and darkness. Rick limps into the woods with Carl, not knowing where Judith is or if she survived. The community they'd built, crops, school, medical bay, all of it, is rubble and flame behind them. That's what the mid-season finale does. It takes the thing they had, and makes sure there's nothing to go back to. The back half of Season 4 is something I find genuinely moving, in a low-key way. There are very few major deaths in it. Herschel and the governor were the punctuation marks, and what follows is the aftermath. But it tells its story in a different register than the prison episodes. It's the sound of the show after a catastrophe, and it's rather good at that specific thing. Zach was killed in the very first episode of Season 4, before the flu, before any of that. A young man, on a supply run, who got trapped under a helicopter and didn't make it out. He and Beth had been together, casually, and when Daryl comes back to tell Beth what happened, Beth says she doesn't cry anymore. She stopped letting herself, and then Daryl gets back in his car and has a moment alone where you can see what he's actually feeling. It's a very small scene that captures something the show kept coming back to, the way grief gets managed and suppressed and stored away, and what the storage costs. The back half of Season 4 separates the survivors into small groups and follows each of them moving through the landscape toward Terminus, which a series of signs promises a place of sanctuary. Daryl and Beth end up in a golf club house, and then a small house in the country, and have a very long conversation about who each of them was before, and who they've had to become. Tyrese and Carol and the girls navigate the grove, which we've already talked about. Glenn and Maggie look for each other across hundreds of miles. Rick and Carl and Michonne find a house and rest and recover. What the second half of Season 4 does is give the characters time, which the prison's action-heavy seasons rarely allowed. Time to sit with what happened. Time to have conversations that aren't immediately interrupted by a plot development. And in that time, you can see what the show is actually good at when it's not in crisis mode. Small human moments, specific and honest, between people who've known each other through terrible things and are still trying to figure out what that means. There's an episode called After, the Season 4 mid-season premiere, that I think is quietly one of the best of the entire series. It's almost entirely Rick and Carl alone, with Carl angry and scared and furious in the way teenagers can be when they're terrified and have nowhere to put it. He goes off on his own. He nearly gets killed. He eats an enormous can of pudding on a roof. He sits in the dark and says aloud, to no one, that he'd be fine without Rick, that he could survive, that he doesn't need his father. And then something happens in his face while he's saying it, and he stops believing his own argument, and he just sits there. When Rick wakes from his own fever and exhaustion and reaches for Carl, Carl holds on to him and cries like a child, because he has won, and because his world just collapsed, and because for all the terrible things he's already done and seen, he still needs his father. That scene costs the show very little in budget or plot and produces something as genuinely moving as anything else the season does. The road to Terminus is the first time in the show's history that the survivors move towards something rather than away from something. The signs are everywhere, consistent, promising sanctuary and community. They follow them. Even Rick follows them, and Rick follows almost nothing on trust anymore, and Terminus is a cannibal compound. The people who put up those signs, Gareth and his group, did once believe in the idea of sanctuary. They tried it. People came and took everything and left, and the lesson they drew from that experience was that the only viable philosophy was predation. They eat people now, which is presented in the show with a specific kind of horror that's distinct from walker horror. Walkers do what walkers do. Terminus is a choice repeated daily by human beings who decided this was how they were going to survive. The show doesn't spend a lot of time mourning the Terminus people when they're eventually destroyed, and I think that's correct. Some things have simply gone too far. The group reassembling at the church and the specific quality of relief that Reunion carried, that's real, even after Terminus, even after everything. They find each other and they're still them more or less, and that matters. Season 5 is exhausting in the best possible sense. It moves faster than any previous season, changes locations more frequently, and loses major characters at a pace that the show had never quite attempted before. 3 significant deaths in 9 episodes, each of them landing differently, each of them asking something different from the audience. Bob Stookie is played by Larry Gilliard Jr., which is worth noting because Larry Gilliard Jr. also played T-Dog, and the show does something interesting here. Bob has many of the qualities that T-Dog deserved to have exercised on screen. He's warm, reflective, a recovering alcoholic who found something worth holding onto in the group. A man in love with Sasha, who keeps finding reasons to smile even when smiling doesn't make any sense. He and Sasha have a game they play. You name something terrible, and he finds the silver lining. It's a lovely, specific little detail. He gets bitten at the food bank in episode 2 of season 5. Underwater, in the dark, a walker gets his shoulder, and he doesn't tell anyone. And then the Terminus survivors capture him and cut off his leg to eat it. And while they're doing that around their fire, Bob leans forward and laughs at them, because the leg they're eating is tainted meat. He was bitten. It won't do them any good. That scene is one of the more darkly funny things the show produced, which is not a sentence I expected to write. But it works because Bob is genuinely unafraid. The bite is a sentence. He knows it, and he's found a way to make peace with it, and the laugh is real. He dies a few episodes later, in a house, with Sasha by his side. He tells her the good that came from all the bad, and she cries, and he's right that there was good. He wasn't wrong about that. One small additional detail about Bob that I think the show handles beautifully. In his final scenes, he's not trying to convince anyone of anything. He's not making a case for optimism or trying to reframe his death as meaningful. He's just present. He's just glad. The game he played with Sasha, you name something terrible, and he finds the silver lining, isn't a coping mechanism in those last moments. It's just who he is. That's rare. That's genuinely rare in a television character, and it's worth noticing. Beth Green. I find Beth's death one of the most difficult to process in the show's entire run, and I've had years to process it. Not because it's the most emotionally devastating, I don't think it is, but because of the specific texture of its arbitrariness. Beth has been on a journey for the entire first half of season 5. She was abducted at the end of season 4, taken to Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, which is run by a group of police officers who operate a sort of indentured servitude system. You take someone in and they owe you for the service, and the debt keeps growing. Beth spends multiple episodes navigating this situation, developing relationships, showing extraordinary resourcefulness and courage, becoming someone you believe could survive almost anything. What the Grady arc does for Beth specifically is finish something the show had been building since season 2. She arrived at Herschel's farm as a background presence, the younger daughter, the one who sang, the one who almost gave up in the episode where she locked herself in the bathroom. And across 3 seasons, very gradually, she became someone with spine and purpose, and a specific kind of courage that wasn't the tactical courage of Carol, or the physical courage of Daryl, but something more like moral courage, the willingness to keep being kind and keep singing and keep believing things were worth believing in, even when the evidence was overwhelmingly against it. At Grady, she's not passive. She plans. She helps another patient escape. She pushes back against the system she's trapped inside with the specific methodology of someone who has learned to work inside constraints she can't immediately break. The show's decision to give Beth her own arc, separate from the main group, pays off in ways that make her death more painful. You've watched her become someone fully realized, and then the show takes her away at the moment when that realization was complete. The rescue happens. Rick negotiates an exchange. 2 of their people for 2 of Grady's. Beth and Carol for 2 of Grady's officers. The exchange is happening. Everyone is calm. And then Dawn, the woman in charge of Grady, changes the terms at the last moment and demands Noah as well. And Beth, who is right there, who is about to walk out the door, says, "I get it now," and stabs Dawn in the shoulder with a pair of scissors, and Dawn reflexively shoots her in the head. Dawn is immediately shot by Daryl. Both of them are dead within about 8 seconds. Beth was 2 feet from the door. Daryl carrying Beth's body out of the hospital while Maggie screams. That image. The whole group standing in silence in front of the building in the pale morning. Even now, after everything else the show does, that image still lands. and then Tyrese 9 days later. Tyrese Williams is the show's most persistent argument for not killing people when you don't have to. He's the man who, during the riot at the prison, survived being surrounded by a cell block of walkers by beating them with a hammer rather than firing a gun, which is exactly the kind of detail that tells you everything. He forgave Carol for killing Karen and David. He forgave the world, repeatedly, for taking people he loved. He was, across 3 seasons, the most genuinely decent adult in the group, and the show honoured that by giving him a death full of visions. He gets bitten trying to save a boy in Noah's destroyed community. The bite happens because he was distracted by a photograph of the boy and his brothers, by the fact that he was trying to understand what Noah had lost rather than managing the immediate tactical situation. This is not a character flaw. It's the thing that makes Tyrese who he is. The inability to be only tactical. The need to understand rather than just react. In another world, in a different kind of story, this quality would be an asset. In the world of The Walking Dead, it's a vulnerability. The bite is the world's response to that specific kind of openness. And while the others work to amputate his arm and hope it's in time, Tyrese sees the dead. The governor, the claimers leader Martin, Bob, Beth, Lizzie, and Mika, all of them visiting while he bleeds. The governor telling him the bill has to be paid. Bob and Beth telling him it's okay, that it's not as bad as he thinks. Lizzie and Mika saying it's better now. The girls are smiling. What the show gives Tyrese in those visions is something very specific. The dead are not accusatory. The people he couldn't save are not holding it against him. The governor is there to represent the world's cruelty, but he doesn't win the argument. The others, the ones who loved him or were loved by him, are telling him that the cost of staying was always going to be too high, and that the place he's going, wherever that is not something to be afraid of. It's a beautiful episode, and a beautiful ending for a character who deserved every second of it. His death says something the show was always circling, that the gentlest people pay the highest price, not because they're weak, but because the world cannot afford them for very long. Season 5 loses Bob, Beth and Tyrese in 9 episodes, and the cumulative effect is exhausting in a way the show calculated carefully. Each death lands in a different register. Bob's is warm and dark and strangely funny. A man who has genuinely made peace with things, using his final hours to make one last point about the absurdity of what's trying to take him. Beth's is sudden and arbitrary and 2 feet from the door, and you never quite get over the 2 feet. Tyrese's is slow and visionary and almost tender, the show letting him walk out of the world rather than be dragged from it. What the show was doing across those 9 episodes was demonstrating the range of what loss could feel like. It's not always the same shape. The same world taking people at roughly the same time produces grief that is categorically different depending on who the person was, who they loved, and what they were in the middle of when it happened. Season 5 understood that, and used the understanding deliberately. The 3 deaths feel nothing alike, because the 3 people felt nothing alike. That's the show at its most precise. The group arrives at Alexandria in the back half of Season 5, and the Alexandria arc across Seasons 5 and 6 is the show's most sustained examination of a specific question. Can the people this group has become actually live inside a community? Can they be citizens again, not just survivors? The answer is complicated, and the deaths that punctuate Seasons 5 and 6 are largely structured around the gap between what Alexandria thinks the world is and what Rick's group knows it to be. Noah's death happens in Season 5, Episode 14, called Spend, and it's one of the show's most viscerally horrible sequences. A supply run goes wrong in a building, walkers flood a revolving door, and Glenn watches through the glass as Nicholas Kaur, one of Alexandria's people, a man who had already been demonstrated to be a coward who had gotten people killed, panics and pushes past Glenn, getting Noah trapped. The walkers pull Noah in. Glenn watches. He cannot do anything. The revolving door is between them, and there are walkers pressing from both sides, and Noah dies in a way that the show does not look away from. What makes Noah's death hurt is the timing and the trajectory. He'd just had a conversation about his future. He'd told Glenn he was going to make it, that he was going to learn everything Glenn could teach him. He had a sketchbook full of architectural drawings of a future community he wanted to help build. The show establishes all of that and then removes him, and the cruelty is precisely in the gap between the planning and the interruption. Deanna Monroe runs Alexandria, and she's played by Tova Feldscher with a specific kind of tired intelligence, a former congresswoman who built something real and is holding it together with will and compromise, and the occasional sacrifice of her better instincts. Her husband Reg dies in the season 5 finale when Pete Anderson, in a confrontation, slashes Reg's throat with a machete that was supposed to threaten Rick. It's sudden and it's wrong, and Deanna is standing 3 feet away when it happens. There's a detail about Deanna and Reg's relationship that the show handles quietly across their episodes together. They are, genuinely, good to each other. In a show full of marriages and partnerships that are defined by conflict and loss and the things people can't say, Deanna and Reg are just kind to each other. Reg follows Maggie out of the room during the argument about what to do with Rick and tells her that civilization starts when you stop running, that the cavemen had to decide one day to stay put, and that's what they're all doing now. He's a gentleman and an honest one, and his death is so sudden and so wrong that for a moment the show seems to hold its breath. She tells Rick to do it. Kill Pete, right there on the street of Alexandria in front of everyone. And Rick does. Deanna spends season 6 in a kind of accelerated grieving. For Reg, for the idea of Alexandria she'd been protecting, for the version of herself that believed walls and rules and good intentions could hold the world back. She gets bitten during the Walker invasion of Alexandria in the mid-season finale, and she spends her final hours absolutely blazing, shooting walkers with wild, screaming abandon, spending every bullet she has left with her face fully alive, not sad, just entirely committed to the end of it. She asks Michonne what she lives for, and Michonne tells her, and Deanna listens with the expression of someone taking notes, someone who wanted to know the answer so she could carry it with her. She asks Rick to watch over her son Spencer. She goes into her room and she's alone. And then she's alone and she turns her gun on herself rather than turn. Nicholas, separately, dies in episode 3 of season 6, called Thank You, the same episode with the revolving door. His death is, in a sense, the cause of Noah's death, which makes the accounting complicated. Cornered on a dumpster with Glenn surrounded by walkers, Nicholas shoots himself. He falls onto Glenn, and Glenn falls into the herd. And then, this is the show doing something genuinely audacious and also genuinely divisive. Glenn survives. The walkers were eating Nicholas, not Glenn. Glenn pulled himself under the dumpster, and the show made us grieve Glenn for 2 episodes before revealing he was alive, which is either brilliant long-form tension or a cynical fake-out depending on who you ask. I have feelings about this that I'll come back to in the section about the actual Glenn death. The Anderson family is one of the show's more quietly tragic constructions. Jessie is a woman trying to rebuild a life inside Alexandria after years of abuse from her husband Pete, who Rick killed at the end of season 5 at Deanna's order. Her sons Ron and Sam are each damaged in specific ways. Ron furious, displaced, reaching for something to blame. Sam gentle and young and unable to reconcile what he's seen. Rick falls for Jessie. It's handled carefully and it's genuinely affecting. 2 damaged people finding something, tentative, in the middle of everything. And then the Walker herd floods Alexandria in season 6, episodes 8 and 9. And the Andersons are killed in a sequence that's almost operatically terrible. The group covers themselves in Walker guts to move through the herd undetected. They hold hands in a chain. Rick, Carl, Michonne, Jessie, Ron, Sam. The instruction is clear. Don't stop. Don't react. Stay quiet. Keep moving. Sam can't do it. He starts calling for his mother. He freezes. The walkers turn. Sam is taken. Jessie watches her son die. She can't let go of Carl's hand. Walkers take Jessie. Rick hacks through her wrist to free Carl. Ron raises his gun, blaming Rick, blaming the world, the rage he'd been carrying all season, finally finding an outlet, and Michonne runs him through from behind. Ron's shot goes wide and hits Carl in the eye. The entire Anderson family, gone in about 90 seconds. It's not cathartic, and it's not meaningful in any redemptive sense. It's just the cost of a moment's hesitation, in a world with no patience for hesitation. Sam was a child who got pulled apart by circumstances that no child should have had to navigate. And the show is honest about the fact that his death is horrible and nobody's fault, and that doesn't make it better. Denise Cloyd is the show's doctor in season 6. She's an anxiety-ridden psychiatrist who became a doctor by necessity, someone who had spent most of her life talking herself out of things, and who, in the second half of season 6, starts actively forcing herself to be brave. She goes on a supply run she didn't have to go on, clears a convenience store alone because she wanted to prove she could, and finds a bottle of Orange Crush in the back. An Orange Crush she was going to bring back for Tara, because Tara loves Orange Crush, and Denise loves Tara. The speech she's giving when Dwight shoots her is worth describing, because it's the speech the show had been building her toward all season. She's talking about fear and choice, about how she knows she could be braver, and how she keeps choosing to be anyway, and how the point isn't that it stops being scary, but that you keep going, despite the scared feeling, rather than waiting for the scared feeling to stop. She's talking to Daryl and Rosita about the mundane heroism of the everyday, and she's doing it on a railroad track in the middle of nowhere, holding a bottle of fizzy orange drink, and it's genuinely moving in that specific way that small honest moments in good television can be. And she dies in the middle of it. The bolt takes her eye mid-sentence and she finishes the sentence anyway. The last of it, the final clause, delivered with the arrow already in her head because the body doesn't stop until it stops. And then she's gone. Merritt Weaver played Denise across 6 episodes with an honesty and specificity that made her one of the most fully realised, short arc characters the show ever produced. The loss is the loss of a person, and also the loss of the speech she was giving, which she never got to finish. Daryl hears what she was saying. He was the one she was talking about. The fear she was describing was something she recognised in him, something she saw and was trying to reach. He spends the rest of the series trying to finish the thought. Her death is the show pivoting hard toward the Negan era. It is the last death before the lineup. It plants Daryl's crossbow in Dwight's hands and puts the seed of a specific rage in Daryl that will have consequences. Season 6 ends with the group on their knees in a clearing in the woods. Negan has arrived. And then the season ends, mid-swing, with a first-person shot that tells you someone is being beaten to death, but does not tell you who. It's a cliffhanger that generated enormous anger. The kind of deliberate withholding that feels like the show playing with the audience's investment rather than trusting it. I understand the argument for it. I also understand why it made people furious. Both things are true. Season 7, Episode 1 is called The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, which is one of Negan's lines from the comics, and it's the episode that settles the question. 2 answers, not one. Abraham Ford first. Abraham is played by Michael Cudlitz as a man who is mostly architecture. Broad shoulders, military bearing, a moustache that communicates that he has stopped caring what anyone thinks about his moustache. But under that architecture is someone who came very close to falling apart completely and chose, repeatedly, not to. He lost his family in the very first days of the apocalypse. He found Eugene and his mission to Washington, and he held on to that mission with both hands for 3 seasons, because the mission was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. When Eugene's mission turned out to be a lie, when the scientist who was going to save the world was actually a frightened man with a mullet who had invented a purpose because having a purpose was the only way he could think of to get people to protect him, Abraham was left without the thing that had been keeping him upright. He went through a period in season 5 where he seemed genuinely uncertain whether he wanted to continue, and Michael Cudlitz played that uncertainty without making it melodramatic. Just a man sitting very still, inside himself trying to decide. He decided. He found reasons, new ones, in Sasha and in the work of building something in Alexandria and in the specific pleasure of being genuinely useful at things that mattered. He had a warmth that only appeared once he stopped carrying the mission. Jokes, affection, the willingness to be silly. There's a moment in season 6 where he and Sasha are watching a herd pass from a car, and he looks over at her with an expression that's just happiness, quiet and clean, and it's one of the most human moments the show ever captured for him. Abraham gets picked, Negan plays his game, and the bat ends at Abraham, and Abraham's response is to straighten up and look Negan in the eye and flash a peace sign at Sasha. He's been afraid in earlier episodes, not of dying, but of losing what he'd just found, a reason to imagine a future. And in this moment, he seems to have found peace with it, or something that looks very much like peace. "Suck my nuts," he says to Negan. Negan kills him. The group grieves in real time, and then Daryl lunges forward and punches Negan because that's who Daryl is. He cannot watch someone he loves die without fighting back, even when fighting back is the worst possible thing to do. And Negan says, "That's a violation, and there are no exceptions." And he says, "Back to it," and he walks to Glenn. Glenn Rhee has been in this show since the second episode. He was the voice on the radio in the tank in Atlanta. He became Rick's first friend in this world. He fell in love with Maggie, and it was the most convincing love story the show ever told. He survived Terminus, and a herd in a dead town, and the fake out on the dumpster, and every other thing the show put between him and the future. He sat in the season 6 finale with his hand on Maggie's stomach, the baby they'd been planning for, and he was calm. Glenn's arc, across 6 seasons, is in some ways the show's most complete argument for what it's trying to say about love. He arrives as a young man who helps Rick because it's the right thing to do, and he doesn't overthink it. He falls for Maggie because she's extraordinary, and he sees that before almost anyone else does. He grows up, season by season, into someone who can be afraid and keep going anyway, who can lose people and not become less capable of love because of the losing. Stephen Yeun played him with a consistency and warmth that made Glenn feel like someone you knew, someone whose existence in the show was a permanent reassurance that decency was possible in this world. And then Negan hits him twice, and Glenn manages to sit up, and his eye is no longer right in its socket. And he looks at Maggie, and he says, "Maggie, I'll find you." And then Negan keeps going. I don't think there's anything useful to say about that. The show did it exactly the way it happened in the comics, and it was as difficult to watch as it was supposed to be. Stephen Yeun's performance in those final seconds is genuinely extraordinary. The specific thing Glenn does with his face, what he's choosing to put there for Maggie before the end, is the whole character distilled. The season 7 premiere is hard to watch, and I watch it anyway, whenever I do a reread of the series, because the Glenn Rhee that the show built across 6 seasons deserved to be fully mourned, and the episode earns that, and I'd rather sit with the earning of it than skip to the parts that are easier. The structure of season 7 involves the group learning, painfully and slowly, how to survive under Negan's control. He comes to Alexandria and takes half of everything. He takes Daryl. He distributes the group's losses across multiple communities so that no one community has enough to fight back. It's a very deliberate system, and the show is interested in showing it working, which is sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes brilliant. What season 7 does in its darker stretches is something the show hadn't quite attempted before. It makes the audience feel the oppression rather than just watch it. The early seasons were about surviving a world without structure. Season 7 is about surviving a world with the wrong structure, a world where there are rules and systems, and a chain of command, and all of it is designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance that the story requires. It's a slower horror than the Walker horror because it's bureaucratic. It comes at you through policies and precedents and the slow erosion of what's acceptable. It comes at you through dead-eyed compliance. Rick carrying Lucille, Rick saying thank you, Rick handing over half of everything they've saved and managed and grown and protected. The show makes you watch all of it from a position of helplessness, because the characters are helpless. And what helplessness feels like under a structured regime is different from what helplessness feels like in chaos. It's heavier. It has a shape to it. It knows your name. The deaths in Season 7, Spencer, Olivia, Benjamin, are all variations on the same theme. The way Negan uses death as a tool for maintaining that structure. Not as an end in itself, but as a management technique. Spencer Monroe is the son of Deanna, and he's been a minor irritant throughout Seasons 5 and 6. A man who survived by luck and credits himself for cleverness, who resented Rick's leadership while benefiting from Rick's protection. He approaches Negan privately in Season 7, Episode 8, called Heart Still Beating, and proposes that Negan replace Rick with Spencer as the leader of Alexandria. Negan, to his credit if you can call it that, gives Spencer an honest assessment. He thinks Rick is swallowing his own hatred and doing whatever it takes to protect his people, which takes guts, and Spencer is going behind his leader's back, which does not. "You got no guts," Negan says, and then demonstrates this literally by disemboweling Spencer in the middle of the street. It's a scene that's simultaneously stomach-turning and darkly rather satisfying, which tells you something about the particular moral architecture the show had constructed around Negan. He's a monster who is occasionally right about people, and the show makes sure you notice the occasions. Spencer's death isn't mourned by the audience in the way Denise's or Abraham's was, because Spencer had been established carefully as someone whose survival impulses had crowded out his loyalty impulses, and Negan reads him accurately and punishes him for it. The punishment is grotesque. The reading was not wrong. What's interesting about the Spencer scene is what comes immediately after it, Rosita firing at Negan with the homemade bullet Eugene had made, hitting Lucille instead of Negan, and Arat shooting Olivia in response. Negan's management style is, above all else, consistent. Someone has to pay for every transgression. Rosita transgressed. Olivia, who was standing nearby and had nothing to do with it, pays. Olivia dies in the same episode. She manages Alexandria's pantry. She's been in the background of dozens of scenes since Season 5, a steady, practical presence who worked with what she had and never complained. Negan's Lieutenant Arat shoots her as a message because Rosita tried to kill Negan, and someone has to pay. Olivia didn't try to kill anyone. She was just standing near the consequences. That's a specific kind of cruelty the show uses Negan to examine. The way power, when it operates through terror rather than respect, produces random-seeming casualties that are actually precisely calculated. Olivia's death is meant to demonstrate to Alexandria that nobody is safe, that compliance is not protection, that Negan's reach extends to anyone he chooses at any moment. It works. The Alexandria residents understand. The audience understands. Benjamin dies in Season 7, Episode 13, in an episode called Bury Me Here. He's the kingdom's most promising young soldier, a teenager whom Morgan has been training with his fighting stick, earnest and hopeful and genuinely good. A one cantaloupe shortfall in the kingdom's tribute to the Saviors gives Jared, one of the Savior's more genuinely unpleasant lieutenants, an excuse to shoot someone, and he shoots Benjamin in the legs. Benjamin bleeds out. Morgan sits with him. This is the death that ends Ezekiel's neutrality. The king had been maintaining his careful arrangement with the Saviors because he believed the arrangement kept his people safe, and watching it kill Benjamin, one of the most purely good people in the kingdom, removes the last argument for it. Benjamin's death is, in practical terms, the death that brings the kingdom to war, which makes it matter in the way small particular deaths in this show often matter. Not through grand significance, but through consequence. Sasha Williams is a character the show underserved for most of her run, and then, in her final episodes, gave something genuinely beautiful. She'd been in the show since Season 3, one of the survivors who came with Tyrese, a woman who had lost too many people and who grief had made harder and harder until she was someone who could barely talk about what she was feeling, because talking about it required acknowledging it was there. This is something Sonequa Martin Green played across 5 seasons with real precision. Sasha's grief, not as a wound you could see, but as an architecture. The way she held herself, the way she scanned the horizon, the specific quality of her alertness, which was less about tactics and more about not having anywhere to put everything she was carrying. She lost Thomas before we met her. She lost her brother Tyrese. She lost Bob. She lost the possibility of a safe future multiple times, and each loss made her quieter, more certain, more willing to walk into situations other people would walk away from. Abraham was the first person in a long time who got through. They found each other in the back half of season 6, after he'd ended things with Rosita, after she'd been through Terminus and the CDC and the prison and Bob's death and the church and Noah. They had a few months together, not long enough. After Abraham's death at the lineup, Sasha agrees to help Rosita on a one-way mission to kill Negan. They approach the sanctuary with a rifle and no plan for getting out. She volunteers to be the distraction, and when Negan takes her prisoner, she uses the last of Eugene's poison capsule, which Eugene had made for a different purpose, to take herself out before Negan can use her as a weapon against her people. She comes out of the casket Negan brought her in as a walker. It's her choice. She made it alone, in the dark, on the way to the moment she knew was coming, and she spent whatever time she had left in the casket listening to the music on the iPod Abraham had given her and thinking about what she was choosing. The show gives us her last thoughts as a kind of peaceful vision. Abraham alive, by the ocean, happy. That vision is worth pausing on for a moment, because it's the show's most precise statement about what Sasha's arc was actually about. She didn't die in despair. She died having made the one decision left that was entirely hers, and the last thing she let herself imagine was the person she loved, in sunlight, without the weight of any of it. There's an argument to be made that that's the best death in the show's entire run. Not the most dramatic, not the most narratively significant, but the one that most completely belongs to the person dying. The timing of it, the specific act of making the last decision herself, is the thing the show gives her, and it's the right thing to give her. Sasha's whole arc is about survival and loss and the weight of deciding to keep going, and the show ends it by giving her agency over the moment when she decided not to. Not out of despair. She's not defeated. She's choosing, with full knowledge of what she's doing and why, to do the one thing left available to her that the enemy can't control. Sonequa Martin Green left the show for Star Trek Discovery, and her final episode is one of the best things The Walking Dead did with a character exit in its entire run. I'm going to be honest about this one, which is that I don't think the show handled Carl's death as well as it should have. I think it's a legitimate creative decision. Robert Kirkman has said that killing Carl was his biggest regret in the comic series, and the show made a different choice. But I think the show lost something it needed when it lost Carl, and the final 3 seasons feel the absence. Carl Grimes is 12 years old in season 1. He's the child who grows up in the apocalypse, who has never known the world as anything other than this. The sheriff's hat that Rick gives him is one of the show's most persistent symbols, and Carl wearing it means something different in season 1 than it does in season 4 or season 7, because the boy wearing it is different each time. He shoots his mother. He executes a surrendered prisoner who is reaching for a weapon. He nearly dies twice. He loses an eye, and across all of it, he remains someone who believes that the world can be rebuilt into something worth living in. That's the argument Carl makes with his survival, right up until the end. He gets bitten in season 8, episode 8, an episode called How It's Gotta Be, helping a stranger reach safety in the woods. The stranger is Siddiq, who will later become Alexandria's doctor, which is one of the show's more quietly meaningful through lines. Carl's last act of kindness echoing forward. He hides the bite. He does what he has to do for the community. He helps Alexandria evacuate to the sewers, he fires flares, he works, and then he tells his father and Michonne when there's nothing more to be done about it. The goodbye scene is Season 8, Episode 9, called Honor. Carl sits in the church and talks to Rick and Michonne and says what he needs to say. He's not afraid exactly. He's sad, and he wants things for the people he loves, and he gives Rick a vision, a white-bearded Rick in a garden, children running, Negan alive and part of the community, the future looking like something. He makes Rick promise. Carl gives Judith his hat. That's the last image. Andrew Lincoln's grief in that scene is not something I'm able to watch without feeling it, and I've watched it enough times that I should probably be more immune to it than I am. Chandler Riggs was 19 when he filmed it. He was 9 when the pilot aired. He grew up on that show, and it gave him this final scene, and he earns every second of it. What the show loses with Carl is harder to articulate, but important. Carl was the future in concrete form, not symbolically, but literally, an actual child growing into the world the survivors were trying to build. After he's gone, the argument for all of it becomes more abstract. The show finds other vessels for the same idea, but none of them carry the same weight. There's something the show can't replace when Carl is gone, which is the specific dynamic between him and Rick. Rick's parenting of Carl was one of the most honest ongoing threads the show had. The constant negotiation between wanting to protect a child and needing to let that child become what the world requires. Carl pushed back. Carl had opinions. Carl kept Rick honest in ways that no one else in the group could, because the question Rick was always trying to answer for Carl was the same question the whole show was asking. What are we doing all this for? And what are we becoming in the process of doing it? After Carl, Rick loses the person he was most accountable to, and the show loses the character who was most directly asking its central question. What Chandler Riggs gave this show across 9 seasons was the gradual, careful accumulation of a person under pressure, a child becoming someone in circumstances that no framework exists for. That's an extraordinary thing to have anchored a television series with, and the show was right to build around it for as long as it did. Season 9 begins with a time jump of about 18 months. The war with the Saviors is over. Negan is imprisoned. The communities are rebuilding, growing crops, establishing trade routes, treating something like normalcy with something like care. There are council meetings and supply runs and small dramas about infrastructure. It's the quietest the show had been since the farm. Rick leaves. Not done. He holds the hilltop together in Maggie's absence. He becomes quietly one of the people the show seemed to be planning a longer story around. Tom Payne brought a specificity to Jesus that went beyond the fight choreography, which was excellent. There was something genuinely contemplative about his version of the character, a man who had seen too much and processed very little of it, and kept going because there wasn't a better option. His relationship with Aaron was building into something during Season 9. The show had plans. He's killed in Season 9, Episode 8, called Evolution. A midnight graveyard run goes wrong. The walkers in the cemetery aren't moving like walkers. They're surrounding the group intelligently, and one of them whispers. Before anyone can fully process what's happening, the whispering walker stabs Jesus from behind. Tom Payne's Jesus barely has time to be surprised. The attack is fast and specific, and the character is gone before the audience has adjusted to the fact that the walkers in this scene are people. It's a slightly dissatisfying death in the sense that Jesus deserved more story than he got, and his death as the vehicle for a villain introduction rather than as the conclusion of his own arc feels like the show sacrificing a character for a plot function. I understand why they did it. The Whisperer reveal needed weight, and Jesus' death provided that weight. I still find it a bit of a waste. He was interesting, and the show knew it, and did it anyway. The Whisperers are introduced through his death, and they're a genuinely chilling concept. People who have given up on humanity and disguised themselves in walker skins, moving with the dead, whispering to each other to coordinate their movements. They don't build communities or hold territory in the conventional sense. They live in the herd. Their leader is Alpha, played by Samantha Morton, with a particular brand of quiet, specific menace. Alpha's response to the community sending out search parties for the missing is Season 9, Episodes 15 and 16. She creates a border. She marks the border with pike kicks, and on each pike is a severed head. 10 of them. People the communities had been looking for. Henry, Tara, Enid, Frankie, Tammy Rose, DJ Addy, Rodney, Brett, Ozzy. Enid has been in the show since Season 5, a teenager who survived by herself for months after her parents died, who wrote JSS on every surface she could find as a reminder. Just survive somehow. She found a home in Alexandria and then at the Hilltop. She'd been a doctor's apprentice. She was engaged to Alden. Tara, Lydia, Alpha's daughter, who had defected to the communities, standing in the dark and understanding what her mother is. What the Pike scene does to Carol is worth its own attention, because Carol's Season 10 arc is structured almost entirely around it. Henry's death, Henry whom she'd essentially adopted, whom she'd tried to keep soft in a world that kept demanding hardness, sends Carol into a spiral that the show renders as a specific kind of grief-driven recklessness. She goes to sea, she comes back. She sets in motion the plan to kill Alpha, which she does through Negan, at significant cost to her relationship with Daryl, who doesn't fully know the shape of what Carol's been doing until it's done. There's a scene in Season 10 where Daryl tells Carol that he needs her to not do the thing she's about to do, that he needs her to come back from wherever she's been going, and Carol tells him that she can't yet, that she has to finish this first. And Carol's response is not just grief, it's the final decision of a woman who has been losing people for 11 years and has now run completely out of the thing that lets you keep hoping anyway. Siddiq has been around since Season 8. He's the man Carl saved on the night he was bitten, which is the symmetry the show put into Carl's death. Siddiq carrying forward what Carl's last act of kindness made possible. He became Alexandria's doctor, treating the community and grieving quietly for everything he'd seen, and he was the only survivor of the group that Alpha used for her pike demonstration. He witnessed the deaths of all 10 people on that border. He carries that with him. The show gives Siddiq a storyline across Season 10 that explores what that kind of witnessed trauma does to a person. The way he freezes, the way the memories intrude, the way he can't quite get through a shift in the clinic without the images coming back. It's handled carefully, and it gives Avi Nash real material to work with, and the specific quality of Siddiq's PTSD, not flashy or dramatic, but grinding and persistent and quietly debilitating, is one of the more honest things the show did with the psychological aftermath of violence. He's killed in Season 10, Episode 8, by Dante, who is revealed to have been a Whisperer spy inside Alexandria all along. The murder happens during what appears to be a friendly conversation, and the reveal of Dante's identity is one of the more genuinely shocking things the show did in its final seasons. Siddiq's death is quiet and intimate, and happens before he understands what's happening, which is something the show used sparingly enough that it still works when it does it. Alpha's of the 3 major villains the show produced, she's the only one whose argument I find myself having to actually think through, rather than just dismiss. She's wrong, but she's not incoherent, and that distinction matters more than it might seem. She practices this philosophy in her personal life, in ways that are disturbing and specific. She gave her daughter Lydia to men in the Whisperers to use as they chose. She executed people who showed feeling. Her own grief, when it surfaces, she treats as an enemy to be killed. Negan kills her. He'd been embedded with the Whisperers for months at Carol's arrangement, working his way into Alpha's trust, becoming someone she believed in. And then he takes her to a cabin he'd told her was holding Lydia, and while she's distracted, he cuts her throat. He brings her severed head to Carol, who has been the architect of this plan from the beginning, and Carol holds it without expression, and it means the end of the Whisperer War in the most direct possible sense. What's interesting about Alpha's end is what it does to Negan as a character. He's been rebuilding himself across seasons 8 through 10, carefully and imperfectly, and killing Alpha specifically because of Lydia, because he saw in Lydia something he couldn't let Alpha continue, is the clearest statement the show makes about who Negan is under the version of himself he shows the world. He killed the most dangerous person in the region for a teenager he barely knew because he couldn't let her mother keep doing what she was doing. That's not a small thing. Beta, Alpha's second, played by Ryan Hurst, has a massive, silent, genuinely unsettling presence, leads the Whisperer herd toward the communities in Season 10's finale as a last act of war. He's surrounded by walkers in the field, and they start to close on him, and Daryl unmasks him, and Beta just stops. He looks at the walkers around him, and he seems, it's hard to say this about such a deliberately opaque character, relieved. He opens his arms. The walkers take him. He makes no attempt to run or fight. It's the most coherent characterization the show offers for Beta, a man who stopped believing in the living world long before the Whisperers found him, who was always moving toward the moment when he could stop pretending there was still something in it worth protecting. Beta is the show's most extreme portrait of someone who chose the walkers over the living, and unlike the Governor or Negan, there's no submerged humanity fighting its way to the surface. He is genuinely, completely at peace with what he's become. Ryan Hurst plays him in a register that's almost meditative. There's no rage, no ego, no obvious hunger for power. He moved. Season 11 is the longest season the show produced, 24 episodes, and it splits its focus between the survivors and the Commonwealth, which is the most ambitious post-apocalyptic community the show ever depicted. Tens of thousands of people. Functioning infrastructure, a class system, an army, a governor with political ambitions, and a sociopath's flexibility about means and ends. Leah Shaw, Daryl's relationship in the time between Rick's departure and the present, arrives in Season 11 as a Reaper, part of a group of mercenaries who had been hired by the Commonwealth's more villainous elements. Her arc is one of those Season 11 storylines that feels compressed in ways the show's final run often does, but Daryl's grief about her is genuine, and Lynn Collins plays the character with enough precision that her death, Daryl shooting her to save Maggie, lands with real weight. Lance Hornsby is the show's final bureaucratic villain, a Commonwealth official who believes in the system and uses the system as a weapon, which in some ways makes him more frightening than the characters who simply love violence. He's killed by Maggie, which is narratively satisfying and also a bit abrupt, and the show doesn't quite give his death the space it might deserve. Rosita Espinosa has been in the show since Season 4. She was part of Abraham's original group, the one heading to Washington, the one with the mission. She lost Abraham. She found new things to live for, Eugene, and then Gabriel, and Sadiq, and her daughter Coco. She's been in over 100 episodes. She's been one of the show's most consistently reliable presences. Not always central, but always there, always doing the work. Christian Serratos played Rosita for 8 seasons with a consistency that rarely got the credit it deserved. Rosita was, for much of the middle run, the character who showed up in every scene and made it better without the episode being about her. Her grief, after Abraham, was quiet and specific, and she carried it without asking anyone to carry it with her. She raised Sadiq's daughter after he died. She found something real with Gabriel. Her relationship the show gave more room in the final seasons, and watching them together had the specific warmth of two people who had each spent a long time not allowing themselves anything and had finally stopped arguing with what they wanted. She's bitten in the final episodes, Season 11, Episode 22. She doesn't tell anyone immediately, in the way that the show's most meaningful bite deaths handle it. A period of knowledge before disclosure. A set of choices made while there's still time to make them. She stays long enough to save her daughter. She's honest with Gabriel. She holds what she has to hold. There's a sequence where Gabriel is with her in the final hours, and he's trying to be strong about it, And Rosita is just there, present, looking at him with an expression that's tired and clear, and fully himself, because she's had enough experience with loss to know that the right thing to do with whatever time is left is to be in it, not to manage it or narrate it, just be there. Gabriel holds her hand. The scene doesn't try to be more than what it is, which is the right choice. Gabriel carries her. That's one of the last images the show offers for Rosita, the person who loves her, carrying her. There are other deaths in season 11, and the final season tries very hard to give each of its long-running characters something meaningful, an ending that reflects who they became across the whole span of the show. Not all of them entirely succeed. The compression of 24 episodes of a final season covering an enormous amount of narrative ground means that some characters get more careful send-offs than others. But the show is honest at the end about what it cost. It doesn't pretend the losses were worth it in any ledger balancing sense. It just shows the people who are still standing, carrying what they carry, and trying to make what they're building worth what it took. So that's all of them, or most of them. The ones the show built something around and then took away, from Amy Harrison's campfire death in season 1 all the way to Rosita in the final stretch of season 11. And sitting with all of them together like this, you notice something. Every era of this show has a different kind of death. The early deaths are shocking because the world is new and we don't know the rules yet. The prison era deaths are devastating because the world has become home and then home is taken. The Negan era deaths are brutal because they're meant to establish dominance, to teach the survivors what they're up against. The Whisperer era deaths are quiet and specific, the way grief eventually becomes quiet and specific if you live with it long enough. And the final season, deaths are something else again, more like completion, characters reaching the end of their arcs after years of accumulation. The show acknowledging, at the end, that it had been telling stories about specific people, and those people deserved to have their stories finished with care. The ones who made it to the credits, Daryl, Maggie, Carol, Eugene, Gabriel, Judith, Negan, in his strange piece, each of them is a repository for everyone they lost. Daryl carries Merle and Beth and every version of the group before this one. Maggie carries Glenn and the baby Glenn never met, and Herschel's voice whenever she has to make a hard decision. Carol carries Sophia and Ed's violence and every girl she's had to teach to survive since the farm. Eugene carries his own long shame and the moment he finally started acting on something other than self-preservation. Gabriel carries Rosita and the man he was before the world broke him and put him back together differently. They are not just themselves, they are accumulations, and what the accumulation looks like at the end, in the Commonwealth, in whatever comes after, it looks like a community. It looks like people choosing again and again to stay near each other despite the cost. It looks like the thing Rick Grimes was trying to build since the first season, since before he fully understood what he was trying to build. Not a refuge from the world, but a way of being in the world that doesn't require you to abandon everything that makes you a person. Some of the deaths in this show feel like waste. Sophia is waste, in the sense that the world wasted her. A child who got lost in the wrong moment and wasn't found in time. Beth is waste. Noah is waste. These deaths say that the world doesn't distribute its losses according to merit or meaning. It just takes and takes and takes, and you carry it, or you don't. And the show is honest about the fact that carrying it is the only option. Other deaths feel earned, which is a strange word to use about the death of a fictional person, but I think it's the right one. Herschel's death is earned, not in the sense that he deserved it, but in the sense that everything about it is true to who he was and what the show was saying about hope. Merle's death is earned. Sasha's death is earned. Tyrese's vision-filled final hours are earned by everything the show did with him across 3 seasons. Even Negan's survival is a kind of earned outcome. The show making the argument that the question of redemption is not about whether someone deserves it, but about whether the future you're building has room for it. There's something else worth saying before we finish, which is that The Walking Dead's deaths taken as a body of work, are one of the most sustained meditations on grief in American popular culture. Not because every individual death is handled perfectly, many aren't, but because the show never stops asking what loss costs and what it produces. The characters who survive the longest are the ones who found ways to carry their losses without being defined exclusively by them. Daryl, Carol, Maggie. The show is, at its core, about that balance. How much grief can a person carry and still choose to stay in the world? And its answer, episode after episode, death after death, is more than you think. More than seems possible. More than is probably fair. The number of people who didn't make it across the show's full span is genuinely difficult to hold all at once. We've covered the major ones tonight, but there are dozens more in the margins. People the show named and gave a scene, and then took. People who died in crowds. People the characters mention in passing as someone they lost before we met them. The world of The Walking Dead is thick with its dead. They're in the silences between lines. They're in the way Carol won't walk through certain doors, and the way Daryl still reaches for a crossbow that was taken from him, and the way Maggie looks at the hilltop from the high ground, like she's checking that it's still there. They're in every conversation that starts with someone's name said too quietly. They're in the moment Sasha smiles at a memory. They're in the moment Rick stands at a fence looking out. The dead in this show don't disappear, they accumulate, and the living are walking archives of everyone who didn't make it. That's the show's most truthful observation about grief. It doesn't go away, it becomes part of the architecture. The Walking Dead started with a man waking up alone in a hospital and not understanding the world he'd woken into. It ended with communities, with children, with something that looked, if you didn't look too hard at the cost, like a future. Whether that future was worth what it took is a question the show leaves open, which seems right. Some questions don't resolve, some losses don't balance. You just carry them forward and keep going. Sleep well.